Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Today, I invite you into a legend that echoes through the mist-shrouded mountains of Thrace and descends into the silent, cold depths of the Underworld. A saga of a love so profound that it challenged the very laws of life and death. This story doesn't just tell of the divine melodies that could tame wild beasts and make even the stones weep. It tells of a heart-wrenching journey fueled by the strings of a golden lyre and the desperate hope of a man who refused to say goodbye. We are following the footsteps of Orpheus, the greatest of all poets, as he ventures where no living soul dares to tread into the sunless realm of Hades to reclaim his lost Eurydice from the clutches of eternity. This is a story of a melody that froze the wheels of torture and brought tears to the eyes of the Furies, but it is also a story of a single, fatal moment of doubt on a steep, shadowy path. Orpheus is not just a musician. He is the embodiment of human devotion, a soul who faced the king of the dead with nothing but his art and his grief. In a fate where a silent promise becomes heavier than the world itself and a forbidden backward glance shatters a miracle, you will witness the thin, fragile line between divine triumph and mortal tragedy, and a love that ultimately finds its eternal peace in the golden fields of Elysium. Disclaimer: the visuals in this video were created using artificial intelligence. There are no bloody or disturbing scenes. However, some moments have been designed for cinematic and emotional depth. If you are sensitive to such imagery, please keep this in mind before watching. If you wish to join me on these mythic journeys, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and leave a comment below telling me which story you'd like to explore next. I look forward to sailing through these timeless tales together, one legend at a time. Take a deep breath, relax your mind, and let the rhythm of the waves guide you, wishing you a peaceful sleep. The epic of Orpheus and Eurydice, a love that challenged death, begins now. In very ancient times, on the harsh, windswept yet fertile lands of Thrace, a child was born who changed the fate of music and poetry forever. This child was Orpheus, who would later be remembered as the father of songs and the greatest musician in Greek mythology. His birth was a unique union of the splendor of mortal kings and the inspiration of immortal goddesses. Orpheus's father was Eurydice, the powerful ruler and king of Thrace. However, some accounts whispered that, because of the greatness of his talent, his true father had been Apollo, the god of the sun and the arts. His mother was Calliope, the greatest of the muses and the voice of epic poetry. Calliope was the daughter of Zeus, the ruler of sky and earth, and Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory. Therefore, Orpheus carried in his veins both the nobility of Thracian kings and the endless memory and creativity of the gods. When Orpheus was still a small child, Apollo presented him with an extraordinary gift, a golden lyre. This was not an ordinary instrument. Its strings shone as if they had been washed in sunlight. Apollo did not only give the lyre, but personally taught young Orpheus how to play this sacred instrument in the most beautiful way. Every time the child's fingers touched the strings, the hidden harmonies of the universe were revealed. His mother Calliope taught him not only how to produce sound, but how to add verses that gave life to those sounds. Sitting at his mother's side, Orpheus grasped the meter of epic tales and the power of words. Yet his education did not end there. Calliope's 8 sisters, the other muses, and thus Orpheus's 8 aunts, gathered around this prodigy. Each of them passed on her own style and subtlety to perfect his poetry. In this way, Orpheus reached a level where he could create flawless works in every style known to humankind. As time passed, Orpheus grew into a young man worthy of his divine legacy, carrying a lyrical depth in his gaze. When he took the lyre in his hands, the world stopped and listened only to him. His golden touch softened steel and stone and tamed wild tigers. Even massive creatures from the depths of the sea rose from places never before explored to dance on the sands of the shore. One day Orpheus climbed a bare and shadowless hill. It was a beautiful plain covered with green grass, yet there was not a single tree to provide shelter from the burning sun. The young poet took his golden lyre into his lap and began to let his fingers wander across the strings. As melodies inspired by the sky poured forth, a miraculous movement began around the hill. The harmony of Orpheus's music was so powerful that nature itself moved to offer him shade. Trees began to pull their roots from the soil and walk toward him, as if they had fallen in love with the poet's voice. The oak of Chaon, the poplar of the Heliades, the great branching oak, the gentle linden, and the beech trees formed ranks around the hill. Fragile hazel trees, ash trees suited for spear making, smooth silver firs, and holm oaks weighed down with acorns gathered around the poet. As he played on, maples, riverbank willows, water lotuses, and evergreen boxwoods joined this divine audience. In this magnificent atmosphere, nature itself seemed to kneel before the poet's music. Ivy twisted upward and climbed the trees, and grapevines wrapped their heavy clusters around the elms. As Ovid had described, even the needle-bearing pines sacred to Cybele, the mother of the gods, joined this chorus. For Cybele's beloved Attis had once abandoned human form by transforming into this tree. Orpheus, the son of Calliope and Eurydice, moved not only trees but even lifeless rocks. When he played, the hearts of mountains softened, and stones, caught by the rhythm, arranged themselves around the poet as if building a temple. This magnificent beginning was also a sign of a great tragedy to come. This young man, who controlled nature through his divine legacy and his lyre, was still unaware of the pain that love and death would bring. Although Orpheus's music inspired admiration throughout the world, deep in his heart, he desired the presence of only one person. The wild animals surrounding him, lions, bears, and wolves, were tamed by his melodies, creating an atmosphere of peace where hunter and prey remained together in harmony. Yet this peace was the silence before an approaching storm. With his lyre, the poet celebrated not only nature, but also Zeus's absolute rule over the universe and the victories won against the giants. The days when his cries would fill the highest peaks of the sky were still far away. For now, under the cool winds of Thrace, he played in honor of his mother Calliope and his father Apollo, making the world a little more beautiful with every stroke. At the end of the chapter, Orpheus sat on the hill, surrounded by hundreds of trees, tamed wild animals, and stones wrapped in silence. This was not merely the success of a poet, but the manifestation of a divine power on earth. Yet hidden at the heart of this splendor was tragedy, like a stealthy snake beneath the leaves of a thick oak. Orpheus could change the world with his music, but he could not yet hear the voice of the fates who wove the threads of his destiny. This magnificent atmosphere of Thrace formed the first act of the approaching dark love story. The poet's golden touch subdued everything, but how far music could go in the face of time and death would be revealed in the later parts of the story. In those ancient times when smoky mists drifting down from the peaks of Thracia's fog-laden mountains descended like a shawl into the depths of dense, untouched forests. Even the wind fell silent out of deep reverence for Orpheus, the greatest of poets, and the leaves joined this sacred stillness without stirring. This extraordinary young man, the son of Calliope, the highest of the Muses, and the divine voice of epic poetry, and of Eurydice, the powerful and proud king of Thracia, wandered through the valleys holding his golden lyre, which had been gifted to him by Apollo himself, the god of light, and whose strings shimmered with the essence of the sun. With every step he took, nature fell into silence like a temple blessing his presence, while Orpheus remained completely unaware that he was walking toward the darkest and deepest tragedy of his own fate, namely, the merciless grip of love and death. Each time Orpheus's fingers touched those sacred golden strings, the hidden soul of the earth spoke forth, and the ancient chasm between soil and sky closed. With a majesty worthy of the title Father of Songs, he seemed to rewrite the supposedly unbreakable laws of nature with every note of his music. With his golden lyre, he broke the cold resistance of the hardest steel and softened even centuries-old mute stones with sorrowful compassion. Before his divine talent, the fiercest beasts of the forests, blood-stained lions and frenzied wolves, knelt like gentle children, while the roaring rivers slowed their flow and spread their waters like a sheet so as to follow the poet's enchanted melody and miss not a single note. One day, Orpheus stepped onto a meadow by the shore of a silver-shining river, adorned with emerald green and filled with a fragrance that resembled the gardens of the gods. There he saw water nymphs, the legendary naiads, dancing to cheerful laughter that competed with the murmur of the water. Yet among these nymphs, there was one soul who eclipsed the purity of the water with her clear beauty and stood apart like a star with the mysterious light she radiated. This was Eurydice, the most delicate and most sacred work of nature, whose beauty surpassed the limits of mortal understanding. With his lyre, which until that moment had spoken only of the gods and the creation of the universe, Orpheus began to turn into notes this new and burning sensation that awakened in his heart under the influence of an attraction he had never felt in any corner of his soul before. Orpheus, the most favored student of Apollo, struck the strings with such force under this fresh and immense inspiration that in that instant, not only were trees shaken from their roots and stones displaced from their resting places, but Eurydice's heart, which had never before opened to anyone, surrendered unconditionally to the poet's melody. As the son of Calliope continued to make the universe tremble with his fingers, Eurydice, herself a naiad, silently drew close to the poet as if caught in a spell. Just as the poet's music tamed the wildest tigers of the forest, it erased all the fears within the young woman's soul and left her in the embrace of eternal admiration. When the poet's sky-deep gaze met Eurydice's eyes, clear and deep as the bottom of a spring, all sounds on earth fell silent, along with the whisper of the wind and the chirping of birds. All the noise of the universe gave way to the magnificent harmony between the poet's lyre and Eurydice's trembling, excited breath. From that first sacred moment when Orpheus saw Eurydice, he no longer wished to honor Olympus or the turning of the stars with his lyre, but desired only to honor this singular nymph and to touch her soul. Eurydice, in turn, understood that in the voice of this genius poet, who subdued the world with his golden touch, she had found the missing part of her own soul, her eternal partner. During those enchanted days when no one noticed how time passed, this unparalleled musician of Thracia strengthened his unshakable devotion to Eurydice with every new note and every new verse. Along the cool and healing banks of the Hebrus River and at the foothills of the majestic mist-covered Rhodope Mountains, they whispered vows of loyalty to one another with a sanctity that only the gods could hear. The poet, the son of Eurydice, had closed his eyes to the beauty of all other women in the world and had chosen Eurydice as the sole ruler of his heart and his only muse. The love between them became such a colossal force that even nature bowed respectfully before this sacred bond. When they walked hand in hand, towering trees lowered their heavy branches like devoted servants to shade them, and flowers scattered their finest fragrances along their path. At last, these two magnificent souls decided to bind their lives to a shared future, to seal their love with an immortal vow, and to unite two separate destinies in a single river. Orpheus, the son of Calliope, began preparations to proclaim the woman he loved, the other half of his life, as his wife to the entire world, and to crown this immense union with a ceremony worthy of the gods. As Eurydice willingly left the mysterious and free world of the nymphs to become the wife of a mortal poet, they swore before the greatest of gods that the bond between them would be broken by neither death nor time. This decision was greeted with great joy and excitement from the most remote corners of Thracia to its highest peaks. For this gifted man, who could enchant everything with his lyre, had finally found the true melody of his own soul, his greatest and purest source of inspiration. Yet immediately after this dazzling happiness, the shadow of dreadful days approaching began to appear like a sly serpent in the dark and hidden corners of fate. As they prepared to invite Hymen, the god of marriage, to bless their ceremony on their happiest days, the rusted wheels of destiny had already begun to prepare a bloody and sorrowful end for these two innocent lovers. Still, at the end of this second chapter, Orpheus and Eurydice remained determined to swear their marriage vows as the happiest couple the world had ever known, with the unshakable trust that could move mountains and with the unifying sanctity of music. The poet's golden lyre now played only the joyful rhythms of the approaching wedding night and the triumphant songs of love, while Eurydice dreamed of the endless and blissful days she would spend in the arms of the man she loved, accompanied by this divine melody. This enchanting meeting, and the way love wrapped their souls like a climbing vine, began the brightest and most radiant period of the Thracian poet Orpheus's life. With the unparalleled poetic gift he had inherited from his mother Calliope, he poured out thousands of verses for every strand of Eurydice's hair and every one of her smiles, while all of nature, rivers, mountains, and forests continued to bear unshakable witness to this eternal love. Yet sadly, Orpheus, who had conquered the hearts of both mortals and immortal gods with his golden lyre, did not yet know that the dark days were waiting at the door, when he would cry out the name of the woman he loved in sorrow-filled laments that would tear the sky apart. For now there was only love in the world, the pure joy flowing from the strings of the lyre, and the two souls losing themselves in one another covered the approaching great tragedy with a pink and deceptive veil. The golden lyre that echoed across the misty peaks of Thrace had, until that day, always heralded the joy of existence and the majesty of nature. In the previous chapters, we had witnessed how Orpheus, son of the legendary King Oeagrus and the divine voice of epic poetry, Calliope, or a man whose every note bore the unmistakable signature of Apollo, the god of light himself, had bent the supposedly unbreakable laws of the universe to his will with his lyre. The melodies that flowed from his fingers had not only turned the fiercest clawed lions into gentle house cats, they had also placed an eternal seal upon the heart of the nymph Eurydice, whose clear beauty shamed the purity of water itself. This magnificent, timeless meeting of two souls had been crowned with a decision to marry, joyfully greeted by all of nature. Mountains and rivers had stood ready like witnesses blessing this union. Yet sadly, the dark and winding threads of fate had not always been woven with songs of victory and brilliant light. That evening, when the sun withdrew behind the rugged mountains of Thrace like a weary giant, and the sky wrapped the earth in a sorrowful veil of purple, lilac, and burnt gold, the magnificent wedding festivities had begun in the land of the Cicones, along the southern coasts of Thrace. The cool wind blowing in from the sea carried the excitement of the crowd, gathered to witness the union of the happiest couple in the world, along the shore, accompanied by the lyre of Orpheus, the father of songs. Yet when Hymen, the god who was the absolute guardian of weddings, vows of fidelity, and the sacred bond of marriage, set foot in the ceremonial space, the atmosphere was shaken by the weight of an unfamiliar, indescribable gloom. Hymen descended into the ceremony as if he were gliding upon a cloud, wearing his ever-present saffron-yellow robe. However, there were none of the expected joyful laughs, celebratory melodies, or blessing gazes that usually accompanied the arrival of this divine being. The god neither honored the ceremony with a single kind word, nor looked into the lover's eyes with that promise-filled happiness. On the contrary, he remained utterly indifferent to the vast celebrations swirling around him and to the enchanting voice of Orpheus, which had until then subdued all things, standing as emotionless as stone. Orpheus made the strings of his lyre ring with the most joyful hymns, using that unmatched technique he had received directly from Apollo, offering his most passionate melodies to honor this sacred union and invite the god's blessing. Yet Hymen neither appreciated this divine music nor opened his sacred ears to it. His gaze was fixed on emptiness, his spirit seemingly anchored in some other dark realm. Even more frightening and unsettling was the sign held tightly in the god's right hand, the famous wedding torch. This torch, which normally should have burned with a flame bright enough to rival the stars in the sky and illuminate the future paths of the newlywed couple, refused to ignite and take on its sacred fire. Its tip crackled incessantly, as if it were being smothered by an invisible darkness, and instead of flame, it spread a pitch-black, dense, suffocating smoke into the air. The smoke was so thick that it plunged the ceremonial space into the silence of a funeral home, burning the throats and bringing tears to the eyes of the joyful naiads and the guests attending the rite. Tears that should have flowed with happiness and excitement had turned into a sorrowful ache under the searing effect of this ominous smoke. Orpheus, with the deep and sensitive soul of a poet that came from being Calliope's son, immediately sensed this dark premonition hanging in the air, this uncanny silence. His fingers were still on the strings, but the notes spilling from his lyre no longer spoke of joy. Instead, they seemed to whisper a dirge for an approaching great destruction, a mournful rehearsal for cries yet to come. Eurydice, meanwhile, tried to suppress the faint but cold shiver that was sprouting in her chest as she looked at her husband standing beside her with the pride of a statue. Hymen's frightening silence and the dim, smoking state of his torch felt like a quiet yet certain herald of the storm that was about to break. The ceremonial ground, weighed down by the heavy atmosphere Hymen had brought with him, had taken on the air not of a celebration, but of a silent waiting, of standing on the threshold of mourning. The cheerful whispers among the guests had given way to the throat-burning scent of smoke and to an inexplicable emptiness settling into everyone's heart. No one dared to break this heavy silence, for the blessing withheld by the god had created an irreversible absence even for the greatest lovers in the universe. Hymen disappeared swiftly into the darkness just as he had come, leaving behind no favorable sign, not even a single smile, as soon as the ceremony ended. This ominous wedding night was, in truth, the end of an era and the opening curtain of a great tragedy. The lyre of the great bard, known as the Father of Songs, fell into such a sorrowful and unsettling silence for the first time in his life that night. As Hymen's saffron yellow robe faded into the darkness of the night like a pale yellowish stain, the dense smoke left behind at the ceremonial ground seeped like a treacherous fog into the earth stepped upon by Eurydice's still fresh bridal feet. Within that soil, a poisonous fang lay hidden, silently lying in wait for its victim, harboring a maddening pain that would soak the next day's sun in blood. This wedding, which should have turned into a divine feast, a celebration that would have made the gods themselves jealous, had instead become a rehearsal for mourning, a farewell ceremony shaped by the gods' deafening silence. Orpheus and Eurydice believed that with the unshakable love they felt for one another, a love they thought could bend all things to their will, they could scatter these dark clouds. Yet Hymen's torch, which never ignited, and the eyes made to weep by smoke, had already proclaimed the inevitable judgment of fate, the catastrophe that was about to erupt. At the end of the chapter, as the ferocious sound of the waves along the Thracian shores mingled with the final black fumes of the torch, Orpheus and his sorrowful bride Eurydice clung tightly to one another, unaware of the true pain that awaited them, of that merciless end. Nature, however, no longer accompanied its poet's music with joy. Instead, the leaves ceased their rustling, the birds fell silent, and the world quietly began to mourn. The next day, the joyful cries of the naiads that would have echoed through the fields were destined to give way to a scream of agony that would tear the sky apart. In the previous chapters, we had witnessed with deep admiration the story of Orpheus, the sublime bard who was famed in every corner of the universe as the father of songs, born of the divine lineage of the muse Calliope and the Thracian king Oeagrus, or, according to some, of the light god Apollo himself. We had left behind those magnificent, bliss-filled days in which he tamed wild lions with his golden lyre, and the divine touch flowing from his fingers stilled raging rivers and made them listen, and finally sealed his soul with Eurydice, the sole meaning of his life. Yet within the dark and winding loom of fate, the snares being woven had lain in wait to cast a deadly shadow even over the sweetest and purest melodies. The ill-omened wedding ceremony, which the god of marriage Hymen had attended in his saffron-yellow cloak but whose torch had refused to ignite, and instead had exhaled only eye-stinging black smoke, had in fact been the clearest and most painful herald of the approaching catastrophe. While happiness for Orpheus and Eurydice had lasted no longer than the refrain of a song, a treacherous poison hidden deep within the Thracian soil, among the roots of flowers, had stirred to ignite the fuse of this great tragedy. On that fateful morning, Eurydice had been, as always, as graceful as a spring branch and a source of light carrying all the joy of life in her veins. Shortly after the ill-fated wedding, at that clear hour of morning when the sun had warmed the deep valleys of Thrace and the silvery riverbeds with its first rays, she had gone out to mingle with the wind upon the lush, fresh grass, together with her ancient friends and playmates, the naiads, the water nymphs. Her husband Orpheus, who enchanted nature anew each day with Apollo's lyre, had not been with them at that moment. Perhaps the bard had then been in the shaded coolness of his home, whispering the lines of a new love composition he would offer to his beloved, rehearsing those singular harmonies. As the naiads had joined Eurydice's radiant joy with cheerful laughter at her every step, the forest, unaware of the great destruction that was about to befall it, had been wrapped in a peaceful and sacred silence. Yet this innocent calm had soon been shattered by the dark, sickly desire in a stranger's eyes. According to some deeper versions of the tale, the shepherd Aristaeus, who had been grazing his flocks nearby, had noticed Eurydice's unearthly beauty, a beauty that even goddesses would envy, and his soul had begun to burn with an uncontrollable savage passion, without caring in the slightest that the woman before him had been the cherished wife of a great bard, Orpheus, who possessed a divine inheritance. Aristaeus had pursued her like a predator locked onto its prey. The moment Eurydice had recognized that sinister intent in the stranger's eyes, an inexorable fear had seized her heart, and she had fled like a gazelle into the depths of the green valley. Alas, fate had already marked her path of escape with a deadly and irreversible trap. Other quieter accounts had made no mention of Aristaeus at all. They had merely whispered that Eurydice, while innocently dancing and gathering flowers with the water nymphs, had failed to see the disaster, the cold death hidden among the drooping grasses. Whether Eurydice had been fleeing in terror from a shadow behind her, or walking joyfully in the embrace of innocence, she had ultimately stepped into a lethal valley concealed among the grass, into the lair of a venomous viper, where even daylight had seemed afraid to enter. In that second, time had frozen as if halting all the gears of the universe. With a sly, cold, and sudden motion, a serpent had sprung from the earth and sealed its deadly fangs like a stamp into Eurydice's pure white soft ankle. Eurydice, the daughter-in-law of Calliope, Orpheus's only anchor in the world and the reflection of his soul, had collapsed to the ground with a searing pain that had shaken her body from end to end. The black, chilling poison flowing from the serpent's sharp fangs had rapidly consumed the warm life force in the young woman's veins like a spreading ink stain, tearing her away from the world of light. As the naiads' joyful cries that had once made the sky ring had within seconds given way to terror-filled screams that made all of nature shudder, Eurydice had breathed her last right there, upon the flowered grass of Thrace, still wet with morning dew, with an unfinished smile upon her lips. As her soul had trembled and parted from her body, Eurydice had left the world of light, sound, and scent forever, and had begun to be swept like a cloud of dust toward the depths of Hades, into the dark underworld ruled by shadows, silence, and unending cold. In that moment, what had died had not been merely a woman, not merely a water nymph. It had been the entire meaning of Orpheus's music, the full spirit of the lyre, and the most beautiful composition in the universe. When Orpheus, the father of songs, had found his wife's lifeless body lying cold and motionless upon the grass like a marble statue, the immense grief he had felt had surpassed all the limits a mortal heart could bear. As the great poet Ovid would later describe centuries afterward, the dreadful cries torn from Orpheus's chest and the mournful, shattered melodies pouring from his lyre had filled even the highest peaks of the sky and the gates of Olympus itself with sorrow. Nature had fallen into absolute silence in the face of its master's unbearable pain. Leaves had withered, birds had fallen silent, and the wind had ceased to blow in order to share in the bard's mourning. Yet Orpheus had refused to accept this insidious absence of Eurydice, this cold reality of death. That his wife had been torn from him by a vile poison rising from beneath the earth had transformed within the bard's soul into a madness and an unshakable resolve that dared even to challenge the gods and overturn the laws of nature. Those skillful, miraculous fingers trained by Apollo's own hands would no longer play joyful spring songs or praises of love. They would now strike the strings for a single purpose alone: to take back his beloved from the grip of death, to soften the darkest heart of darkness by addressing it directly. The son of Calliope and Eurydice had sworn to descend into that dreadful realm of the dead, where the living dared not enter, and to demand Eurydice's soul back from Hades himself. This terrifying decision had been the first and bravest step that would set in motion the next act of the tragedy, the famed journey into the Underworld, where light would defy darkness and life would defy death. In this chapter, we had seen in all its starkness how Hymen's smoky and ominous signs had ended in a bloody conclusion, how the joy of the water nymphs had fallen victim to a storm of mourning, and how Eurydice's irreversible eternal journey had begun with a serpent's bite. The hidden poison in the bosom of the earth had condemned not only a body, but also the most exalted love in the universe to the silent, merciless darkness of the underworld. Yet Orpheus, bearing that divine and unyielding power within the strings of his lyre, had been preparing to set out, with a fire burning in his soul, toward the famed dark Taenarian gate in Laconia, to challenge the finality of death and the decree of the gods. The fertile valleys of Thrace, which had only moments before echoed with the silvery laughter of the naiads and intoxicated the senses with the scent of flowers, suddenly seemed to surrender their entire soul in a single breath and sank into the heavy, icy, and deafening silence of death. Orpheus, known as the father of songs and the greatest musician the entire Hellenic world had ever seen, ran after the woman he loved and found her upon the lush green grass, lying motionless and pale, like a marble statue laid into eternal sleep. As was well remembered, Orpheus was the legendary son of Calliope, the greatest of the Muses and the queen of epic poetry, and of the Thracian king Eurydice, or, according to some, of Apollo himself, the light-giving god who illuminated the entire cosmos. The golden lyre that he had received directly from Apollo possessed a divine power that could move ancient rocks from their places and tame the wildest blood-clawed tigers into the gentleness of lambs. Yet in that ill-fated second, this sacred power in the poet's hands was about to become not a blessing, but the instrument of the greatest sorrow the universe had ever known. When Orpheus fell to his knees beside Eurydice's body, whose freshness had not yet fully faded, he realized with overwhelming horror that her famed pure beauty, clear as the transparency of mountain springs, had begun to slowly wither beneath the cold shadow of death. The ominous signs given earlier, when Hymen, the god of marriage, had failed to ignite his torch on that cursed wedding night and had produced only a dark smoke that burned the throat and filled the eyes with tears, had now turned into the most painful and naked truth. As the poet grasped Eurydice's white and delicate ankle with trembling hands, he saw the mark of the treacherously gleaming venomous fang that had poured death into her body. His wife, while wandering innocently through the meadows with the water nymphs, had stepped upon a sly viper hidden among the grass and had died on the spot in the spring of her life, from the lethal poison the snake had injected into her veins. As the Rhodopean poet tightly embraced the body of the woman he loved, which was beginning to lose its warmth, as if he might restore her to life, he felt the noble blood flowing through his veins, blood inherited from both kings and gods, burn under the searing fire of grief. The magnificent art of epic poetry he had received from his mother Calliope and the flawless musical mastery he had learned directly from Apollo, which ruled over the harmony of the universe, now served only one dark purpose: to cry out to the entire cosmos the greatest and most ferocious mourning that the world, the stars, and the gods had ever heard. Orpheus's golden lyre no longer spread the joy of spring or the promise of dawn. With every strike of the strings, the notes that poured forth, as the great poet Ovid had described, filled even the highest peaks of the sky and the gates of Olympus, the dwelling place of the gods, with sorrow-laden wails that tore at the human soul. This grief was so immense that the ancient rhythm of nature was shaken by the poet's cries and lost its balance. Creatures that once emerged from the darkest abysses of the ocean to dance when he played a joyful melody, now fell into a deep silence before this mournful lament, as if the end of the universe had arrived. In the world that had been plunged into pitch-black darkness by Eurydice's departure, Orpheus accepted no consolation and no easing of pain. Though the forest nymphs and his ancient companions gathered around him and tried to share this unending ache, he now spoke only with his lyre, with those lifeless golden strings, and whispered his wife's name into the infinite and wordless void of the sky, not like a prayer, but like a rebellion. This merciless wound opened in the poet's soul, tore him away from the world of the living, from the light of the sun, and from everything that breathed. He believed that even the gods had to account for this unjust death and this unfinished love. Orpheus, the most favored student of Apollo, fully understood that love had gone beyond a mere emotion and had completely conquered him, and that without Eurydice's presence, he could never complete the few days granted to him on earth. The immense power of the god of love within him gave him a madness and a courage to challenge the cold reality of death and the unshakable laws of fate itself. He had lost not only a wife, but in truth, the other half of his soul, his existence and his music. If the earth, the sun, and nature could not give Eurydice back to him, then he had to do what no living mortal dared to do and force the forbidden gates of the dark realm where shadows ruled. He decided that even the dark underworld, that unfeeling kingdom of shades, had to recognize the misery and sorrow brought by this death. With this unyielding resolve, he swore to descend personally into the realm of the dead and to drive death back. After spreading his songs of mourning to the most remote and forsaken corners of the earth, Orpheus decided to carry these sorrowful melodies before the dreadful rulers of the Underworld, Pluto and his wife Persephone. With his lyre, he could knead the hardest steel-like dough and give voice to even mute stones. Now he intended to try to soften the petrified hearts of the dead and the rigid, irreversible laws of the Underworld through the power of his music. Setting out with this immense grief, the unquenchable fire in his chest and his unbreakable will, the poet finally reached the Taenarian Gate, located at the dark borders of Laconia, where even sunlight feared to seep through. This place was one of the rare and ominous passages in the world that opened into the realm of shadows, into that deep darkness from which there was no return. With the golden lyre that carried the very light of the sun in his hands, and that vast lament which shook both the sky and the depths of the earth in his heart, Orpheus took his first brave and irreversible step into this dark passage. He had only one purpose: to enchant and persuade Pluto, the relentless ruler of the places below, with his music, and to ask that the thread of Eurydice's life, cut by that treacherous snake, be woven again by the fates, stronger than before. The divine melodies that had echoed through the windy mountains of Thrace and made the sky tremble with sorrow were slowly preparing to give way to the deafening, icy silence of absolute death. As was remembered, Orpheus, the father of songs, who was the son of Calliope, the greatest of the muses and the queen of epic poetry, and the Thracian king Eurydice, or according to some ancient traditions, directly the son of Apollo, the god of the sun and the arts, had found no consolation anywhere on earth after the other half of his soul. Eurydice had been torn from life by the bite of a treacherous snake. This great poet, who had shaken the sky, the gods, and all the elements of nature with mournful laments played on his golden lyre, finally reached a decision that no mortal had ever dared even to imagine. In order to reclaim his beloved, he had sworn to descend into the world of shadows, a place feared by the living. To begin this impossible and terrifying journey, Orpheus reached the ominous Taenarian Gate at the southernmost edge of Laconia, a passage to the underworld where even sunlight hesitated to seep through. This place marked the beginning of that thin yet seemingly insurmountable boundary between the world of the breathing and the silent kingdom of shadows. The poet, holding the legendary golden lyre personally gifted by Apollo, whose strings governed the harmony of the universe with every note they released, took his first brave and irreversible step toward the heart of endless darkness. As he descended through the dark corridors toward the 7 depths beneath the earth, the air grew heavier with every step, and pale, faintly glowing phantoms and silent shadows, freed from their graves and earthly forms, began to surround him. Orpheus used his miraculous music, which had once stopped rivers in their flow and forced lifeless stones into sobs, to carve a path through these unfeeling souls. At last, he reached the shore of the dark river Styx, whose waters carried forgetfulness and sorrow, and which bore the souls of the dead to the misty edge of eternity. On the river's fog-laden bank waited Charon, the infernal ferryman, with dim eyes and a face as hard and merciless as an ancient rock. Under normal circumstances, the hard-hearted Charon, who admitted no living soul into his boat and demanded a silver obol for passage, hesitated in astonishment when he saw this breathing mortal playing a sorrowful melody on his lyre. Orpheus, the poet of Rhodope, touched the golden strings of his lyre in such a way that Charon's calloused heart of thousands of years melted and softened within that mournful lament. This divine music, which enchanted the ferryman's soul, flung wide the gates forbidden to the living. For the first time in history, Charon carried a mortal to the opposite shore, to the land where the true and terrifying rule of shadows prevailed, without demanding any payment. The terror awaiting Orpheus on the far shore of the river was far greater than Charon's hardened heart. At the gate of the underworld stood the legendary beast Cerberus, three-necked, with venomous snakes bursting from each neck, who greeted the poet with dreadful growls that shook the walls of the cave. As the great poet Ovid carefully described in his accounts, Orpheus had not come there to chain this Medusan monster, or to overpower it with strength. He had been driven solely by the unshakable and pure power of love. As all three heads of the beast were about to attack the poet with greedy fury, Orpheus once again struck the strings of his golden lyre, this time with a deeper reverence. The enchanting and divine sounds that spread from the lyre instantly calmed Cerberus's ancient rage. For the first time since the founding of the underworld, the three-headed monster grew docile before a mortal, lowered its snake-entwined heads to the ground, and silently opened the way for him to pass. Advancing deeper into the underworld, toward that boundless void and the ominous corridors of the kingdom of silence, Orpheus passed among sinful souls writhing in endless torment. The poet's music was so powerful and so full of compassion that the ancient punishments wherever he went miraculously stopped for a moment. Tantalus, scorched by thirst and trapped in endless anxiety, became enchanted by the poet's lyre, stopped trying to grasp the water that fled before him, and felt his soul fill with a brief coolness. Ixion's perpetually spinning wheel of fire froze in awed stillness before the unique beauty of that fleeting harmony. The relentless vultures that eternally gnawed at the giant Tityus's liver withdrew their talons under the spell of the music and pulled away from their victim, listening in silence. The Danaids, condemned to the futile task of carrying water in sieve-like vessels, dropped their buckets and surrendered themselves to this divine melody. Even Sisyphus, who carried a massive rock uphill in an endless cycle, sat upon his stone when he heard the poet's voice and rested as he listened to that incomparable lament. Within this enchanting and spiritual atmosphere, Orpheus finally reached the dark throne chamber, where the absolute and dreadful rulers of the underworld resided. There stood Pluto, Hades, the lord of the realm of shadows, and beside him sat Persephone, the queen of the dead, upon her throne with her sorrowful beauty. The poet knelt before these mighty rulers and began to sing with his lyre the most moving and heartfelt song a mortal could ever voice. In his song, he explained that he had not come to solve mysteries, defy the gods, or display power, but had come only to beg for the thread of life of his beloved Eurydice, who had been cut down in the spring of her life by a serpent's poison to be woven anew. Standing in all his gravity before Hades and Persephone, this son of Calliope declared that the god of love, Eros, love, ruled every heart on earth, and that perhaps this name was not foreign even in this dark and profound world, reminding them of the ancient and deep love that Hades himself had established by abducting his own wife Persephone from the world above. The poet demanded, in the name of this place of fear and kingdom of silence, that Eurydice's soul be granted back to him. Orpheus ended his song with the following shattering and irrevocable sentence that made the entire underworld tremble. If the fates refused this final plea of mine, then I would not return to the world of light. At that point, you could celebrate your dark victory with the deaths of two. In the farthest, most extreme corridors of the dark realms, within that endless, lightless void, where even silence weighed upon the soul like molten lead, Orpheus, known as the father of songs and the greatest musician of the entire Hellenic world, took his steps toward the heart of the underworld, toward the center of absolute dominion. As the reader had remembered from the magnificent scenes of earlier chapters, Orpheus had been born as the son of Calliope, the divine muse of epic poetry and heroic narrative, and of Eurydice, king of Thrace, or, as some traditions held, of Apollo himself, the light-bearing god whose radiance illuminated the entire cosmos. In his hands, he carried the legendary golden lyre, bestowed upon him as a gift by Apollo himself, an instrument whose every note flowing from its strings had been able to rewrite even the harshest laws of nature, its radiance piercing the darkness. Orpheus passed like a ghost through the vast, ominous emptiness of the underworld known among the living as the place of fear, and at last he appeared before the rulers of the Shadow Kingdom. Before him sat the true master to whom all mortals eventually bowed, the final destination of every breathing being. Pluto, Hades, the unshakable lord of the realm of shadows and the dark kingdom. Beside him sat Persephone, whose grace cut through the gloom of the underworld like a star, the abducted yet now reigning queen upon her throne. Hades held in his grasp the mysteries of the entire universe and the key to the dead, his gaze cold and formidable like ancient glaciers. Persephone, though torn from the light of spring and the living earth, had gained a new, fearsome and deeply dignified authority as the dark queen of the underworld, a magnificent goddess in her own right. Orpheus, the favored student of Apollo, did not kneel in supplication before this awe-inspiring and terrifying sight. Instead, with the unbreakable courage that flowed through the veins of love itself, he clutched his golden lyre more tightly. As the great poet Ovid would describe with admiration thousands of years later, when the bard gently let his fingers move across those sacred strings, the first true harmony ever heard in the underworld rose and echoed through that realm which had remained silent since the beginning of time. This music was not merely a physical force that uprooted massive trees on the surface of the earth and set lifeless stones in motion. It was also the purest cry of the soul of Orpheus, son of song, who dared to challenge death, fate, and the gods themselves for the sake of the woman he loved, Eurydice. As the bard began his song, he set his voice to the deepest and most poignant tone that could harmonize with the heavy atmosphere of the underworld. While addressing its mighty rulers, he wove his words stitch by stitch with that flawless, smooth, and enchanting meter he had inherited from his mother Calliope, the supreme master of eloquence. In his song, he clearly stated that he had not come to this shadowed world driven by idle curiosity. He had not sought vain acts of heroism such as gazing upon the dark corridors of Tartarus or chaining the three-headed terror-spreading dog Cerberus. In this throne room, he stood not merely as a hero, but above all else, as a grieving husband mourning his wife. He had come to reclaim the unfinished life and unjustly severed thread of existence of his beloved Eurydice, who had departed from life in the spring of her youth with the venom of a treacherous serpent still coursing through her veins. At the most piercing and heart-rending moment of his song, Orpheus, the son of Calliope, looked directly into the blinding darkness of King Hades' eyes, and delivered a shattering reminder. He recalled the ancient and dust-covered tale of how Hades himself had once stolen his own wife Persephone from the flower-filled fields of the living world. If those old legends and the whispers of poets had spoken the truth, then the only force that had united Hades with this beautiful queen and softened the rigid heart of the underworld had been love itself. By invoking the absolute authority of Eros, the god of love, over kings and gods alike, the bard asserted that this burning power had not been a stranger even in the cold corridors of the underworld, and he appealed to the most hidden, most human, and most vulnerable side of Hades. If I were to make a request, a plea in the name of this place of fear and this silent kingdom, Orpheus cried out, without silencing his golden lyre for even a moment, it was that the freshly cut thread of Eurydice's life be woven again, and that the years stolen from her be returned. The bard argued that every living person would eventually come to this shadowed realm, that all rivers would ultimately flow into this dark sea. Yet Eurydice had been taken too soon, torn away before her season had come, like a poppy plucked early while swaying in the wind. Faced with this devastating truth and the soul-searing melody poured forth by the bard's lyre, Hades and Persephone leaned slightly forward upon their stone thrones, as if for the first time in their history they had shared in the grief of a mortal. Orpheus's song carried such power, such a spiritual force, that even the endless eternal torments of the underworld froze in that moment. Tantalus, writhing in infinite anxiety, stopped reaching for the water that fled from his lips at the instant he touched it, and forgot his thirst. The flaming wheel of Ixion halted its rotation, held wonder-bound by the beauty of this divine harmony. The relentless vultures that had gnawed for centuries at the liver of the giant Tityus withdrew their talons and stepped back from their victim to listen to this sorrow. The Danaids, Belides, who had endlessly carried water in perforated vessels, dropped their buckets and burst into sobs. Even the famous and eternal stone-bearer Sisyphus sat upon his rock, cradled his head in his hands and sank into the bard's grief. Yet the true miracle occurred in the hearts of those believed to be utterly devoid of mercy and compassion. According to legend, for the first time in history, tears streamed down the rigid, hardened cheeks of the Eumenides, the Furies, the unyielding and terrifying defenders of vengeance. This mournful melody softened even the most rigid laws of the realm of the dead, even the very decisions of the fates themselves. With his golden lyre, Orpheus, the son of Calliope, had conquered not only the physical world, but now also the senseless realm of souls and shadows. At the end of his song, Orpheus played his greatest and most dangerous card against the rulers of the underworld. If the rusted wheels of fate and your justice rejected this cry of mine, then I would never return from here to the light of the sun. You could then celebrate that dark victory you gained in this silent kingdom with the death of two innocent souls at once. This stood as the final defiance of love against death and the gods. The bard who had enchanted the world with Apollo's gifted lyre had bound his life to his wife's fate with such an unbreakable bond that he preferred to remain an eternal ghost in this realm of shadows with Eurydice, rather than endure an eternity without her. Hades and Persephone could no longer remain indifferent before this divine music, this shattering eloquence, and above all, this unyielding devotion. The sorrowful, yet dignified and honorable melody, rising from the bard's golden lyre, broke the iron will of the rulers of the underworld. Pluto and his queen silently exchanged glances and decided to summon Eurydice from among the pale shades who had newly entered the underworld that day. This chapter depicted in its most magnificent form the supreme manifestation of the bard Orpheus's divine legacy, not upon the surface of the earth, but within the underworld itself, showing how he seared the unfeeling hearts of its rulers with his lyre, and how he concluded an impossible negotiation with absolute victory. With his unmatched talent and the immense poetic genius he had inherited from Calliope, the bard had brought even death to heal. Yet in the next act of the tragedy, upon that dark path of ascent, a terrible and treacherous condition lay in ambush, ready to cast a pitch-black shadow over this monumental triumph. In the smoky, pitch-black depths of the underworld, within that vast, lightless void, where even silence pressed down upon the soul like a heavy lead coffin, the ancient laws of time and space began to tremble at their very foundations, under the melodies flowing from the golden lyre of Orpheus, son of Calliope. As had been remembered, Orpheus had been born as the son of Eurydice, the mighty king of Thrace, and Calliope, the absolute queen of epic poetry among the muses. He had been endowed, through the sacred golden lyre given to him by the god Apollo himself, who ruled over art and the sun, with the power to make lifeless stones speak, to move towering trees from their roots, and to bring even the fiercest wild beasts to their knees. Now, after the premature and sorrowful death of his wife Eurydice, taken by the treacherous bite of a serpent, he had stood in the icy throne room of the unshakable rulers of the realm of shadows, Hades, Pluto, and Persephone, and had turned the greatest grief ever witnessed on the surface of the earth into notes woven with divine harmony. In the ominous atmosphere of the dark throne room, Pluto, the absolute and merciless lord of the underworld, and Queen Persephone, who still carried in her lap like an ache the longing for the fresh flowers of the upper world, had watched with a terror-tinged admiration the god-defying courage of this mortal bard and the power of the cosmic harmony emanating from his lyre. In his song, the poet had cried out that he had not descended into these deep passages out of empty curiosity, but rather that he had come down driven by the unbreakable force of love, the power that burned and shattered all things and opened every door. He had reminded Hades of that unforgettable, immense love through which he himself had seized Persephone from the daylight and seated her upon this dark throne. As Orpheus's voice seeped into every crack of this kingdom, etched into the minds of the living as the place of fear, the deafening silence that had reigned in the underworld since creation gave way, for the first time in history, to sobs and to a miraculous stillness in which time itself seemed to stop. Each time Orpheus had set the strings of the golden lyre trembling with that divine touch personally taught to him by Apollo, even the imprisoned souls condemned to the most terrible and heaviest punishments of the underworld had suddenly been enveloped by a wave of peace. The first of these had been Tantalus, whose soul had been gnawed by anxiety, condemned to eternal hunger for having stolen ambrosia and nectar from the sacred table of the gods and shared them with mortals. Although Tantalus had stood waist-deep in cool waters, he had burned with thirst, and although branches heavy with ripe fruit had hung just above his head, he had been scorched by hunger. Whenever he had reached his lips toward the water, it had withdrawn like a ghost, and whenever he had reached for a fruit, the wind had carried the branches away into the sky. Yet when Orpheus's sorrow-filled but equally enchanting song reached his ears, Tantalus had, in that moment, stopped trying to catch the water that constantly fled before him, had forgotten his eternal hunger, and his soul had been filled for the first time. As the great poet Ovid had described, the retreating water no longer wounded Tantalus. Instead, the bard's music had quenched his thirst. When these divine melodies flowing from the lyre reached another eternal prisoner, Ixion, a miracle had occurred as well. Because of his arrogant and disrespectful desire for the goddess Hera, Ixion had been bound forever to a wheel spinning in flames in the underworld, hurled about by the terror of the winds. Yet when Orpheus, the son of Calliope, had begun to play, Ixion's endlessly turning wheel had come to a halt, frozen in wonder-bound awe before the beauty of this divine harmony. The 1,000-year creaking of the wheel had given way to the golden sound of the lyre, and for the first time since the day his punishment had begun, Ixion had listened to that divine tone without dizziness, motionless and reverent. This epic melody echoing through the farthest passages of darkness had even torn away, if only for a moment, the unending sorrow from the giant Tityus. As had been remembered, Tityus had dared to attack the sacred Leto and had been struck down by Apollo and Artemis, and upon his body, which had covered 9 acres of land, his liver had been condemned to be devoured by vultures in an endless cycle. Yet Orpheus's song had been so moving, so shattering, that the relentless vultures tearing at the giant's liver had for a moment withdrawn their bloody talons and had turned into mournful listeners, blending the rhythm of the blood dripping from their claws with the bard's lyre. The same miraculous silence had reached the Danaids, Belides, who had been forced forever to carry water in leaking vessels in vain. These 50 sisters had been punished with this endless and hopeless labor for murdering their husbands in their sleep on their wedding night. But when they had heard the voice of Orpheus, who had enchanted the entire cosmos with the title Father of Songs, each sister had set her sieve-like perforated bowl upon the ground and had allowed the sorrowful melody to wash over their souls with a mother's tenderness, granting a sacred pause to their unending torment. Perhaps the most striking and heart-wrenching figure of this tableau had been Sisyphus, who had tried to trick the gods with his cunning and had therefore been condemned to push a massive boulder to the summit of a hill for eternity. Each time the stone had nearly reached the top, it had slipped from his grasp and rolled back down, and Sisyphus had relived this crushing cycle again and again. Yet when Orpheus's golden lyre had traversed the dusty and sorrowful paths of the underworld kingdom, for the first time in history, Sisyphus had sat idly upon his famous boulder and had drifted into rest. This time, the stone had not rolled back down the hill. The sweat streaming from Sisyphus's brow had mingled with the grief the bard had poured out for Eurydice, and the torment had been replaced by the singular peace bestowed by music. The bard's music had shaken not only the prisoners, but even the most rigid, merciless, and emotionless beings of the underworld to their core. Even the iron-hardened hearts of the Eumenides, the Furies, symbols of vengeance, endless rage, and horrific punishment, had been scarred by this divine sorrow. Ancient sources had reported with dread that, for the first and only time since the world had been founded, the rigid cheeks of those merciless goddesses of revenge had been moistened by tears flowing in response to Orpheus's music. This scene had proven to the entire universe that mercy and love could find a place for themselves even in the darkest and most forgotten corners. Hades and Persephone, The imposing rulers of the underworld seated at the center of all these miracles had no longer been able to remain indifferent before this sight. Orpheus, the son of Calliope, had once again proven that he could make lifeless stones weep with his lyre, and had shown the entire underworld that the only force capable of subduing death and fate had been love and its divine manifestation in art. Hades had finally softened in the face of a mortal's unshakable devotion to his wife and the divine depth of his music, and he had agreed to reweave the severed thread of Eurydice's life and grant her back to the bard. This mercy of the rulers had marked one of the rare moments in history when the rigid and unbreakable laws of the underworld had bent for the sake of love. At the end of the chapter, Pluto and Persephone had called Eurydice forth from among the pale and newly arrived shadows. The young woman had come gliding like a vision, still moving slowly and unevenly because of the deep wound opened by that ominous serpent. The bard Orpheus had enchanted all the inhabitants of the underworld with his golden lyre, had brought eternal torments to a halt, and had achieved the impossible by securing permission to reclaim his wife. Yet this great acceptance by the rulers would also bring with it a far more difficult, far more mysterious and insidious condition that would have to be overcome. Orpheus's divine heritage and the magnitude of his love had carried him to this victory. But as he departed from the realm of these weeping shadows toward the light, the true great trial of his soul had only just begun. The final sorrowful notes that flowed from Orpheus's divine golden lyre continued to echo through the vast realm of the underworld, where all light and hope had long since faded, drifting like a faint leak of light among the shadows. This young man, known as the Father of Songs and the greatest bard of all ancient ages, had succeeded for the first time in history in breaking the eternal and wordless stillness that had endured since the founding of the land of the dead, thanks to the singular magic he had created with his lyre. As Orpheus, the son of the greatest muse Calliope and the Thracian king Eurydice, or by divine lineage Apollo himself, stood before the unshakable rulers of the underworld, Pluto and Queen Persephone, he had done nothing more than turn the deep, incurable wound opened in his heart into notes, and had made the universe weep. As the reader would have remembered with an ache in the heart from the previous chapters, the bard had not come here out of simple curiosity. He had dared to cross mortal limits by demanding the return of his only wife, Eurydice, whose life had been taken in its prime by the venomous fangs of a snake. As the great poet Ovid had whispered to us across millennia, even the pale, blood-drained inhabitants of the underworld, who had long since lost all feeling, had been overcome by sobs in the face of the immense grief expressed through Orpheus's lyre. Tantalus, punished with eternal hunger and unquenchable thirst, had abandoned his attempt to grasp the waters that fled before him like an illusion and had been lost in the soothing resonance of the music. The massive wheel of Ixion, which had spun endlessly in flames, had stood still in admiration before the flawless beauty of the harmony created by the bard, had fallen wonder-bound, and had ceased its age-old creaking. The vultures that had mercilessly gnawed at Tityus's liver had withdrawn their talons from their victim. The Danaids, who had vainly carried water in perforated vessels, had set their buckets aside and had listened to the bard's mournful verses. Even Sisyphus, famous for pushing his heavy stone uphill, had sat upon his rock as if upon a king's throne and had fallen into absolute silence. For the first time in history, the rigid cheeks of the Eumenides, the merciless and unyielding defenders of vengeance and justice, had been moistened by the voice of this sorrowful bard, a student of Apollo. Queen Persephone of the Underworld and Pluto, the absolute lord of the shadows, had been unable to resist this divine music and the unshakable love behind it any longer. By reminding Pluto of the burning love he himself had once felt when he had abducted his wife Persephone from among the flowers of the earth, Orpheus had proven that even in this place of fear, love had been stronger than the cold laws of death. The son of Calliope had wished for the half-cut thread of Eurydice's life to be rewoven, and had thus become the first and only mortal in human history to challenge death. By the command of the rulers, Eurydice had been called by name from among the new and pale shadows that had entered the underworld that day. The young woman had, only a short time earlier, just after the smoky festivities of her wedding, stepped on a viper while joyfully wandering through the fields with the naiads, and had bid farewell to her dreams through the poison released by that treacherous snake. Hearing the summons, the nymph had begun to move toward her husband through the dark corridor illuminated by his lyre. However, her steps had been slow and her movements sorrowful, for she had still limped from the pain of the fresh wound on her soft ankle. As Orpheus waited with his lyre in his lap like a lifeline, he had felt in his heart the soundless approach of his wife, limping among the silent ghosts like the rustle of a leaf. Yet, while standing in the presence of the rulers, he had not yet dared to turn his gaze toward her. When Pluto, the lord of Hades, had looked into the bard's eyes and had announced the terrible and essential condition, the smoky, heavy, and gloomy air of the underworld had grown even sharper and had pierced the bard's soul like a blade. Orpheus had been permitted to take his wife and return once more to the world of sunlight and light. However, this divine favor had been bound to a condition that seemed impossible, and that ground patience and will into dust. The bard was never, ever to turn back and look behind him until he had led his wife out of these dark underworld valleys and had reached the golden light beneath the sky. If he were to fall into doubt for even a single moment, to show weakness, and to break the condition by looking at his wife behind him, this miraculous gift of return would be withdrawn forever, and Eurydice would belong to the darkness. Orpheus, the son of Calliope and Eurydice, had accepted this heavy and insidious condition with a nod, and had turned toward the exit with his lyre in his hand and storms in his heart. Two wounded souls had begun to climb in silence along that arduous path, dark, steep, and filled at every corner with the whispers of forgotten spirits. Orpheus had advanced at the front, opening the way like a lantern, while the wounded and limping Eurydice had followed him a few steps behind, like a shadow. The doubt within the bard and the burning longing he had felt had grown with every jagged rock they climbed. The reader was never to forget that the bard had been certain that the faint footsteps behind him belonged to Eurydice only because of Hades' unsettling word. Neither a whisper nor a breath had broken this deep, suffocating silence. The underworld had always tested mortals through silence. Throughout the journey, as other flitting fantasy shadows and dreams torn from their graves had swirled around him like moths, Orpheus had been forced to rely not on his immense talent that once bent the universe to his lyre, but now on his own human weakness, his patience. This dark path stretching toward the Taenarian gate had been the thin, fragile bridge ready to snap at any moment between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Only a short distance had remained to the world of light. The pale, greying face of the earth had begun to appear faintly from the heights of the tunnel. The fear of loss within the bard and the burning anxiety over whether the woman he loved was truly there had caused the weight of the condition to grow like an avalanche with every passing second. At the end of the chapter, the weak yet sacred glimmer of sunlight had appeared at the end of the dark tunnel, like a thin line of hope. As Orpheus burned with the desire to check whether his wife had fallen behind because of the snakebite, whether she had vanished into that dark void, only a single step had remained to reach the surface and freedom. Yet this gifted bard, who had enchanted the world with Apollo's golden lyre, had not yet bitterly experienced how terrible and how eternal the price of a single glance, sacrificed to prove his wife's presence, would be in the treacherous, doubt-filled silence of the underworld. The condition had still hung in the bard's mind like a pitch-black shadow. Never look back. In the smoky and sorrowful throne hall of the underworld, the melodies that rose from the golden lyre of Orpheus, the singular bard of Thrace, had finally broken the absolute will that had been thought unshakable. Melodies that had even driven death itself into sobs. Pluto, the majestic ruler of the realm of the dead, and his queen Persephone could no longer remain indifferent in the face of this divine grief. As was remembered, Orpheus, the noble son of the muse queen Calliope and king Eurydice, or according to some accounts of the god of light Apollo himself, had descended into the blindest depths of the underworld to change this dark fate that had begun when a viper sank its treacherous fangs into the ankle of the woman he loved. This divine talent, which had halted Ixion's flaming wheel, quenched Tantalus's 1,000-year thirst, and for the first time in history had moistened the rigid cheeks of the Furies with tears, had achieved the impossible, and had wrested permission to take Eurydice back. Yet this grace, as much a trial as a reward, had been bound to a dreadful condition that would gnaw at the poet's mind like a wolf, until he left the gloomy depths of the Avernian valleys and reached the sacred radiance of daylight. He was never, ever to turn and look back. Orpheus, with the sacred golden lyre in one hand and the presence of his beloved drifting behind him among the newly dead shadows within his soul, took his first step onto the steep, narrow path that stretched toward the Taenarian gate, a path that smelled of abyss with every step. This journey was not merely a physical ascent, it was a dark corridor in which the steadfastness of the bard's will, patience, and above all his immense love was tested. Those miraculous hands, personally trained by Apollo, no longer trembled to pursue joyful melodies on the strings of the lyre, but instead shook as they tried to sense the invisible, silent presence behind him. That deep silence at his back, the deafening and heavy stillness for which the underworld was famed, began with every passing second to turn into the greatest torment in the world for Orpheus. The uncanny path they climbed, as ancient sources had grimly noted, was steep, dark, and wrapped in a dense, damp fog that obstructed all sight. As Orpheus moved slowly upward from the 7 layers beneath the earth toward the light of life and of the breathing world with every step, a single question echoed like a merciless hammer in the darkest corners of his mind. Was Eurydice truly behind me, or were the gods playing a game with me? The poet was certain of the presence of that delicate shadow, that pure nymph only by the uncanny cold word of Hades. Yet in this realm, Neither a footstep echoed, nor a breath was heard. Where death reigned, the rhythm of life stood still. Eurydice, because of the deep wound opened by that ill-fated serpent, still followed her husband with slow steps, limping and losing a little more strength with each one. This slowness was the greatest and most relentless factor that fed the poisonous seeds of doubt in Orpheus's mind. Orpheus, the son of Calliope, had been able to move massive stones and centuries-old trees while singing in the snowy mountains of Thrace. Yet in this pitch-black passage, he could not shift the weight of his own fears. The reader was never to forget that what had driven Orpheus into this impossible journey was not only his art, but also his immense love, which he could not control and which strained the limits of the universe. The god of love had conquered him once, and that love had now become his greatest and most insidious enemy. The longing he felt was so burning, so suffocating, that with every passing second, the urge to look back shook his soul like a storm stronger than the sacred prohibition imposed by the gods. Along the way, pale, ghostly, glowing visions and flickering fantasy shadows newly freed from their graves fluttered around them like leaves. As Orpheus silently paced those smoky paths he had once crossed by enchanting Charon with his lyre, he bitterly realized that his golden touch and divine melodies provided no benefit in this silent ascent. Eurydice, with her unearthly beauty, was still only a shadow, and this shadow was the single sacred key required for the bard to reclaim the light of life. Yet the silence was so intense, so dense, that Orpheus sometimes feared that his beloved had collapsed from exhaustion and been lost in that boundless darkness, or that the dark forces beneath the earth had already pulled her back. Within his mind, the poet repeatedly replayed the final moments of his beloved, her pale, lifeless body upon the grass, and the ominous, bloody wound mark on her white ankle. While these memories spurred his desire to reach daylight as quickly as possible, they also drove his urge to confirm her physical presence, with a single glance to an unbearable, maddening extreme. As Apollo's golden lyre swung silently on the bard's back, the harmony of the entire universe and the eternal victory of love depended on the final few steps of this ascent. Yet tragedy, like that treacherous serpent, had already clung to the poet's heels and begun to poison his soul. At last, only a very short distance remained to the surface of the earth, to that saving ground. The gloomy, suffocating air of the underworld valleys slowly began to give way to a faint breeze seeping from the world above, and at the end of the dark tunnel, the pale, grey yet sacred glimmer of the light of day became visible. Salvation was now as close as an outstretched hand, as real as a single breath. The moment Orpheus saw the sun's first feeble rays, he began to burn like a volcano with the desire to check whether his beloved had also reached this sacred light, whether she had fallen behind with her wounded and limping leg, or whether she had slipped into those dark abysses. The father of songs, in a momentary fit of madness, suddenly forgot the heavy condition that had been given to him, the god's firm and irreversible warning under the excitement of his love, the burning of his longing, and the weight of his doubt. As ancient sources would recount for thousands of years, the fear of losing his wife again and the relentless, burning desire to see her overcame his will. Just as he was about to leave the tunnel, at that thin, sacred boundary between life and death, light and darkness, Orpheus gently turned his head back, only for a single moment. When Orpheus's eyes met for an instant, the pale, sorrow-filled and lovingly gazing face of his wife, The greatest tragedy of the universe was sealed in that second. Eurydice, at that very moment, just as the heart-wrenching descriptions of the sources had told, suddenly slipped back, as if pulled by an invisible hand, and drifted toward the depths of the darkness. Orpheus reached out his arms in a despair that froze the world. He wanted to grasp his beloved by the wrists and pull her out of that dark pool. But alas, his fingers caught not the warm flesh of his beloved, but only the resisting air that filled the void. Eurydice, who died for the second time, voiced no reproach and no harsh word in response to her husband's mistake, because what had driven her back into death and darkness was the poet's immense, unstoppable love, a love so great that it made even the gods jealous. The final sound that echoed in the bard's ears, mingling with the howl of the rising wind, was the barely audible, sorrowful whisper of his beloved from within that smoky darkness, the word farewell, which shattered his heart into 1,000 pieces. As this word echoed and faded in the depths of the underworld, Eurydice returned forever to the world of shadows, to the absolute and irreversible dominion of Hades and Persephone. Orpheus, the son of Calliope, beneath the sunlight shining directly above him, with his lyre now muted in his hand and an eternal emptiness in his soul that would never be filled, remained alone at the mouth of the tunnel, motionless like a statue. Along the steep and somber paths of the Avernian vales, eternally choked with suffocating fumes, and shaped from sorrow stone by stone, the saddest and quietest procession the world had ever witnessed continued. As the reader remembered with a heavy heart from the previous chapters, Orpheus, the father of songs, carried divine power in his veins as the son of the greatest of the Muses, Calliope, and the Thracian king Eurydice, or by some accounts, the god of light Apollo himself, and he had brought death to its knees. The soul-searing melodies he had poured out before Pluto and Persephone had made Tantalus forget his 1,000-year thirst, had stopped Ixion's burning wheel, and for the first time in history had soaked the cheeks of the merciless Furies with tears. Yet this immense victory, this impossible release, hung by a thread bound to a single condition imposed by the rulers of the underworld. The poet was never, ever to turn back and look until he had completely left the infernal valleys, with his wife following behind him. The path stretched toward the Taenarian gate as a treacherous trail, steep, dark, and smothered in dense mists that blocked vision like a wall. Orpheus walked in front, moving ever closer with each step toward life and the light of the sun, guided like a pole star by his golden lyre. Behind him was Eurydice, who had withered untimely on that ill-fated wedding morning, when a snake had sunk its venomous fangs into her soft ankle, and who was now being summoned from among the pale shades of the underworld. Eurydice still walked slowly, limping and growing a little more shadowed with every step because of the pain of her fresh death and that treacherous wound. This slowness, these unheard footsteps, caused a poisonous doubt to sprout in the poet's heart, growing with every second and gnawing at his soul like a wolf. Orpheus, the most favored student of Apollo, stood in a realm so heavy that silence spread through the veins like poison, and he was certain of his wife's presence only because of Hades' smoky and ominous word. No footstep echoed, and no breath of wind that proved life could be felt. Only the sinister, deafening stillness created by the vast, all-devouring void of the underworld, known as the Place of Fear, surrounded the poet. The surface of the earth, The sacred boundary of light and breathing beings lay only a moment away. If he had endured for just one more second, for the span of a single heartbeat, his divine love would have fully and eternally conquered death. But at that critical threshold, the poet's soul was shaken by the relentless storm of a human weakness. The fear of losing his wife again to that bottomless darkness and the unbearable burning desire to see her became stronger than Pluto's absolute command. Here the reader had to pause and reflect. What had driven Orpheus onto this path and made him challenge death had not been only his lyre, but the immense cosmic love that had conquered him completely. This vast love triggered the doubt in the poet's mind, and Orpheus, defeated by his own will, gently turned his head back to confirm whether Eurydice was truly there. In the fraction of a second in which the poet turned his gaze, the greatest tragedy of the universe was sealed with an irreversible mark. Orpheus saw his wife's pale face filled with endless sorrow, for a single instant like the glimmer of a dream. Yet Eurydice immediately began to slide back into the darkness, as if she were being pulled by an invisible river. In a despair and terror great enough to stop the world, the poet desperately stretched out his arms to seize his beloved and tear her away from that relentless pull. But his hands, as the ancient sources stated in their most painful form, grasped only the yielding air. The form of his beloved slipped through his fingers like untouchable smoke, like an ungraspable shadow, and dissolved into eternity. As Eurydice was driven a second time into death and eternal silence, she never blamed her husband, for what had led her to this tragic end had been the poet's unique, sacred, and unstoppable great love for her. The last sound that echoed and faded in Orpheus's ears from the depths of the underworld was a barely audible, sorrowful farewell that shattered the heart into 1,000 pieces. With this farewell, Eurydice returned forever to the silent kingdom of Hades, to the true homeland of shadows and among forgotten souls. Orpheus fell into such terror in the face of this horrific double death that the sources wrote he remained lifeless and motionless, like one who had seen all three dreadful heads of Cerberus at once and turned to stone in fear, or like Olenus, who had taken his beloved woman's guilt upon himself and been petrified. The son of Calliope, whose miraculous hands with the lyre had once enchanted all the elements of nature, now embraced only emptiness, only nothingness. The poet begged and knelt in vain before the ferryman Charon to carry him across once more, but this time the gates of death closed definitively, never to open again to a mortal. Orpheus sat for exactly 7 days on the foul and smoky shore of the river Styx, without putting a single morsel of food, the gifts of Ceres, into his mouth, sustaining himself only on grief, unending anxiety, and tears that washed his soul, miserable and wretched. The poet, who accused the gods of Erebus of cruelty and of stealing his love, finally returned in absolute despair to the surface of the earth, to the lofty mountains of Rhodope and the snowy peaks of Haemus, lashed mercilessly by the northern winds. Yet this return was not the great victory that had been hoped for, but came burdened with the crushing weight of an eternal farewell carried in his heart, the knowledge that he would never be reunited with her again. The steep, narrow and damp path that stretched from the smoky depths of the underworld toward the sacred light of the earth's surface now echoed only with the heavy, hopeless footsteps of a single man, a poet whose soul had been shattered. As the reader would have remembered with an ache in the heart from earlier chapters, Orpheus, the legendary bard, son of Calliope, queen of the Muses, and the Thracian king Eurydice, or according to some accounts, the sun god Apollo himself, had accomplished the impossible and personally subdued death with his golden lyre. Yet in that ill-fated second, a momentary doubt and the burning, uncontrollable longing he felt for the woman he loved caused him to shatter like glass the sacred conditions set by the rulers of the underworld. Eurydice, limping with the snake wound on her soft ankle, slipped away from the arms of the husband she had been following, vanishing like ungraspable smoke, like an untouchable shadow. With the final whispered word, farewell, that fell from his beloved's lips and dissolved into the depths of the underworld, the poet remained utterly alone on the very threshold of the earth, at the boundary between light and darkness. In the face of this double-layered death he had endured, Orpheus fell into such terror that, as ancient sources described, he remained lifeless, icy, and motionless, like one who had seen all three of Cerberus's dreadful heads at once and been petrified by fear, or like the unfortunate Olenus who had taken his beloved's guilt upon himself and turned to stone. That divine talent which had rewritten even the harshest laws of nature with a golden lyre and had made stones weep was now drowning in the pitch-black silence of his own heart. Once again he yearned desperately to descend into the smoky corridors of the kingdom of shadows and reclaim his wife, but this time the gates of darkness had closed against him forever, like an iron and unbreakable barrier. In profound despair, Orpheus ran once more to the murky, smoky, sorrow-scented banks of the river Styx. There he saw Charon, the infernal ferryman who carried the souls of the dead into eternal oblivion. The poet threw himself at the feet of this grim-faced, thousand-year-old boatman whom he had once enchanted with his lyre, and begged through sobs to be taken across again. However, with a heart hardened by centuries, Charon rejected this request firmly and irrevocably. At that moment, the son of Calliope felt it deep in his bones that he could no longer bend the laws of the underworld, and that the gates of death would never open a second time for a living mortal. After this refusal, Orpheus collapsed on the morning shore of the Styx, sinking into the mud. As the sources stated, the poet waited there in a wretched, filthy, and ruined state for exactly 7 days and 7 nights. During this time, he neither tasted a piece of bread nor drank a sip of water. He was completely deprived of the earthly sustenance that had been the gifts of the goddess of abundance, Ceres, for his soul had already forgotten the taste of life. In Ovid's poignant depiction, throughout those 7 dark days, the poet fed only on pure grief, on anxiety that gnawed at his mind like poison, and on the unceasing tears flowing from his eyes. Every single note that fell from his golden lyre turned into a lament, and every breath drawn from his lungs became an unfinished sob sent into the kingdom of shadows. Murmuring sorrowful songs that accused the gods of Erebus of cruelty and unyielding heartlessness, the poet mourned alone in the midst of infinite silence. Orpheus, who had once eased Tantalus's thirst and made Sisyphus sit upon his stone with his music, was now crushed beneath the immense weight of his own endless grief, and the waters of the Styx grew heavier with his tears. At the end of 7 long and hopeless days, Orpheus saw that not even a single grain of hope remained below among the shadows, and decided to leave these mournful shores of the underworld. He turned his steps upward once more, toward the snowy peaks of Hemus, beaten by the fierce claws of the northern winds, and toward the lofty Rhodope mountains gliding above the clouds. Yet this return was not the triumphant march of a glorious hero, but the exile journey of a living dead man whose soul had remained in the underworld. When the poet reached the freezing mountains of Thrace, the world was still in need of his divine music, but he had completely withdrawn from the realm of the living. For 3 long years, as the sun completed the great zodiacal cycle 3 full times, Orpheus avoided all women of the world, fleeing from their love and attention at every turn. As the sources emphasized, the poet responded to no offer of affection and returned no passionate glance directed toward him. Many noble women and forest nymphs were saddened, angered, and humiliated by his wordless indifference and marble-like coldness. As a sign of his unshakable and eternal fidelity to Eurydice, the poet closed the doors of his heart to all women of the earth forever, like a gravestone. The reader was reminded here that this was the bard who could enchant the entire world with Apollo's lyre, yet no sun ever again illuminated the soul darkened by a serpent's venom and by lost love. Fleeing from women and building an insurmountable wall against this kind of love, Orpheus began, in this sorrowful period of his life, to spend time only with the young men of Thrace. He gathered them around him and told them of nature's hidden secrets, of the delicate principles of music that held the universe together, and perhaps also of the inevitable, freezing cold of death. As Ovid noted, through this attitude, Orpheus became a representative of a new understanding among the people of Thrace. He shared his affection only with young men of his own kind, in a companionship purified of earthly lust or transformed into another dimension. Yet this new life was, in truth, a subtle preparation for the savage end that was approaching, for the bloody rage of the Maenads. Within the poet's silent mourning, the shadow of his torn body and of the head that would be thrown into the rivers had already begun to take shape. The smoke-shrouded peaks and misty valleys of Thrace had continued to echo for years with the endless, soul-scorching, sorrowful melodies that had poured from the golden lyre of Orpheus, long known as the master of all bards. As the reader had carried in their heart since the beginning of this epic journey, this divine musician had been born as the son of the greatest of the muses, Calliope, and the Thracian king Eurydice, or as some said, the god of light himself, Apollo. With the sacred golden lyre he had received from Apollo and the epic poetic genius he had inherited from his mother, he had once given voice to lifeless stones, set ancient trees in motion, and subdued the fiercest tigers with the gentleness of a lamb. However, after he had lost Eurydice, the meaning of his life, to a snakebite on that ill-fated wedding morning, the bard's world had been plunged into eternal darkness. He had forced open the gates of the realm of the dead with his music and had managed to bring her back. Yet by violating the underworld ruler's command to never look back, through a moment of human longing and doubt, he had lost his wife forever, just before the sunrise. After waiting for 7 days on the foul bank of the river Styx, hungry, thirsty, and wretched, Orpheus had returned to the surface world. But he had been no different from a ghost wandering among the living, a shadow woven entirely of grief. For 3 full years, while the sun had completed its mighty circuit of the zodiac 3 times, he had avoided all women of the world and had rejected every passionate offer of love directed at him with a marble-like coldness. This unshakable fidelity and the impenetrable wall he had built against women had planted deep seeds of anger, jealousy, and destruction in the hearts of the women who lived in the Thracian mountains and burned with the fury of rejection. One day, vast and frenzied festivals held in the name of Bacchus, Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, had begun on the windy hills of Thrace. The Ciconian matrons of Thrace and the Maenads had wandered through mountains and forests in a state of wild frenzy, wearing the skins of savage animals and carrying ominous thirsty staffs adorned with vines. During these uncontrolled celebrations, Orpheus had sat on the peak of a hill and had once again played his sorrowful yet universe-enchanting melodies on his lyre. Around him, thousands of colorful birds, tamed snakes, and wild animals had gathered, all captivated by the sacred spell of his music, as if all of nature had been accompanying the bard's unending mourning with profound reverence. Yet this sacred peace had instantly turned into a bloody nightmare when the women, blinded by the lust for revenge, had noticed the bard. One of the women, staring at him with hatred from the hilltop, had shouted as her hair had whipped in the wild wind, "Look, here was the man who mocked us, who scorned our love, whose heart had turned to stone." With this cry, the women had begun to hurl themselves at the bard like starving hyenas. The first sharp spear that had been thrown had been aimed at Orpheus's mouth, from which divine melodies had flowed. Yet the spear had shattered in mid-air and had fallen to the ground without leaving even a mark, stopped by the invisible shield of harmony created by his music. Even a heavy rock that had been hurled had hung suspended in the air before the enchanted tones of the lyre's golden strings, as if it had silently prostrated itself at the bard's feet, like a supplicant for daring such an attack. The Maenads' savage fury had now reached an uncontrollable and unimaginable point. To overcome the supernatural protective power of the bard's music that had stopped spears and stones, they had resorted to a method that had been as ingenious as it had been treacherous. They had decided to drown out the bard's sacred sound with overwhelming noise. Berecynthian pipes, horns made of bone, thunder-like drums, and the women's shrill, maddened screams had created a cacophony that had torn the sky apart and destroyed all harmony. When the lyre's fine, pure, and divine voice had been swallowed by this vast sea of noise, the spell that had protected nature had shattered like glass. Stones and spears had now reached the bard and could harm him. The first stones that had rained down had soaked the delicate body of the owner of that now silenced divine voice in blood. The women had seized heavy plows, sharp rakes, and shovels that farmers working in the nearby fields had abandoned in panic. With these iron tools, they had first torn apart the innocent animals around the bard, and then had fallen upon Orpheus himself with all their savagery. As the bard had raised his hands toward the sky and had cried out to the gods in vain for the first time in his life, that divine breath which had once halted rivers and subdued wild tigers had slipped from his torn body and had merged with a mournful wind. As Ovid had described with horror, during this blind rage the women had torn the bard apart like a sacrificial victim. Each limb of Orpheus's dismembered body had been scattered across Thrace. However, the most miraculous and sorrowful events had concerned the bard's head and his golden lyre. The Maenads had hurled his head and the lyre into the cool waters of the river Hebrus. As the sacred head had been carried along by the current and had spun in the middle of the river, it had still murmured sorrowful melodies. The tongue that had tasted death had continued to whisper those unique tunes upon the water. The strings of the lyre, too, had produced mournful sobs with every touch of wind and water, and the riverbanks had answered this final lament with a sorrowful, echoing cry. This sacred burden had drifted along the river and had eventually reached the vast seas, washing ashore on the coast of the island of Lesbos. When a savage snake had attempted to attack this miraculous head, from which fresh blood had still flowed, the god Apollo himself had intervened. The god had turned the snake's open jaws into cold stone on the spot, thus protecting the memory of his son and most faithful student. The Muses had gathered the bard's other scattered limbs with great mourning and had buried them in Pieria. It had been said that night birds there had sung more sorrowfully and beautifully than anywhere else in the world. The people of Lesbos, meanwhile, had buried the bard's head like a treasure, and through this sacred burial the island had become for centuries the cradle of the greatest poets and musicians. Yet the true victory of the story had taken place underground, in the world of shadows. Orpheus's soul had descended into the underworld for a second time, now in a permanent and peaceful way. As he had moved along the paths of the realm of shades that had once seemed terrifying, he had feared neither the cruel Charon nor the frightening growls of Cerberus. Gliding among all the souls he had once enchanted with his music, he had reached the Elysian fields, where only the purest spirits could go. There, running toward him through the mists, he had found Eurydice, whom he had longed for throughout his life, and for whom he had dared to face death. When the two lovers had embraced each other, the immense love between them had been strong enough to warm even the coldness of death, like an eternal spring sun. There had no longer been any treacherous snake venom, any divine and heavy prohibition, or any sorrowful path of return that could separate them. In Ovid's unique and consoling description, they had now walked hand in hand and heart to heart across those endlessly green fields. Sometimes they had walked side by side. Sometimes Eurydice had gone ahead while Orpheus had followed her in admiration, and sometimes Orpheus had joyfully moved ahead. Yet there had now been one single difference. Even in the moments when Orpheus had walked in front, he had been able to turn back at any time and look fully upon his own Eurydice, his eternal light, without any fear of punishment, without falling into doubt, and without carrying the anxiety of losing his beloved. With this chapter, the tragic end of the bard Orpheus had been brought to a close by showing how his sorrowful melodies had reached their true and eternal peace. His golden lyre might have been silenced on the surface of the earth, but his soul, united with the shadow of the woman he loved, had completed the greatest, most unshakable, and happiest composition of the universe. Love had finally conquered even death and had established its own eternal kingdom. Thousands of seasons passed since that ancient moment, when the sacred blood seeping from Orpheus's shattered body mixed with the foaming waters of the Hebrus River, and the final sob that slipped between the strings of the golden lyre was entrusted to the wind. As fragments of the poet's body blended into the fertile soils of Thrace and transformed into olive branches or the song of a night bird, his soul was drawn into the eternal peace of the Elysian fields with his beloved. Yet the legacy he left behind did not remain merely a myth preserved in dusty parchments. It endured as the purest manifestation of that unquenchable ache humanity had carried in its chest since creation. Even today, beneath the shadows of steel towers piercing the sky, amid the roar of ceaseless streams of metal, and within the all-consuming speed of the digital world, Orpheus's lyre still played. No, it was not found behind the cold glass cases of museums. That lyre resonated in the sigh of a man who, holding an old photograph at dusk, drifted into the tunnels of the past, and in the trembling fingers of a woman who sought refuge in art to keep alive the memory of a lost friend. Orpheus never truly left among us. He merely changed form. For modern humanity, the underworld no longer meant the smoky gates of Hades or the terrifying growls of Cerberus. Our underworld consisted of those dark, difficult inner corridors within ourselves. Those personal Tartarus realms were formed by regrets, fears, unfinished sentences, and wordless longings. Each of us, at least once in a lifetime, descended those invisible stairways to bring back something we loved. A love, a dream, our innocence, or our childhood. Orpheus's lyre became our creativity in the modern world. The only weapon with which we resisted the cold breath of death was a piece of writing, a painting, a composition, or a glance. Every time a painter struck the canvas with a brushstroke, that painter was in truth trying to pull a Eurydice out of the darkness. As a poet assembled words, that poet pleaded like Orpheus on the banks of the river Styx to Charon. Give me one more chance. I had not finished this story yet. Yet the true piercing core of the tragedy was not the courage to descend into the underworld, but the fragile patience we displayed while emerging from it. That sly condition imposed by the gods, never look back, continued to live on as a whisper in each of our ears. This condition became the greatest trial of modern humanity: faith and trust. At the most critical moments, when we saw the light at the end of the tunnel, we burned with the desire to know whether what lay behind us was still there. This was not merely longing for a beloved, it was the searing fear of whether a future we had labored for, or a value we had believed in, was still following us. Why did Orpheus turn his head? Was it only because he loved Eurydice? No, it was because in that moment, despite his immense divine talent, he could not withstand the weight of loneliness. In the modern world, we too were crushed by the question, "Am I sure?" when we reached the door of success, happiness, or peace. Every time we looked back, every time we fell into doubt, we sent the beauty in our hands back into that smoky darkness. Looking back meant suffocating in the arms of the past and dimming the light of the present with the shadow of old wounds. Orpheus's glance at that moment was, in truth, humanity's fear of its own victory. The Maenads who tore apart the poet's body walked among us today under different names. They were no longer forest nymphs intoxicated by wine and ecstasy. They became today's noise pollution, soulless haste, and coarse rage that devoured all courtesy. Orpheus's lyre fell silent because the noise of the Berecynthian pipes and wild screams prevented that divine harmony from reaching the ears. Even today, we faced a Maenad attack every single day. Amid ambition, competition, the endless urge to consume, and emotionless noise, the delicate, translucent melody of our soul was suppressed a little more each day. A sincere thank you, a quiet walk in nature, or that sorrowful glimmer in a friend's eyes shattered like Orpheus's lyre beneath today's cacophony. Yet it had to be remembered that even as the poet's head drifted in the waters of the Hebrus, it continued to sing. This was the eternal supremacy of spirit over matter, and of silence over noise. Noise only tore the body apart. The song crossed rivers and reached islands. The shores of Lesbos, struck by Orpheus's bloodied head, continue to serve as sanctuaries even today. Art became our Lesbos against all the cruelty of life. Like Apollo, who preserved the memory of the poet, art gathered together the shattered human soul. In moments when life tore us apart, we gathered ourselves as if collecting Orpheus's scattered limbs within a line of poetry, the resonance of a melody, or the shoulder of a friend. When the muses gathered the poet's remains, they left a message for us. No sorrow was ever complete and no destruction remained eternal. Nature itself, as night birds began to sing more beautifully in Pieria, became the greatest proof that pain had transformed into beauty. Humanity learned to sing deeper, more touching, and more human songs after every great tragedy it endured. Without the loss of Orpheus, how could we have understood the noble depth of sorrow today? At the end of the legend, Orpheus and Eurydice, walking hand in hand across those green eternal fields, became the great hope that still allowed us to stand today. Despite all of life's injustices, all its sly serpents, and all our backward glances, we wished to believe that somewhere beyond time and space, there existed a destination where everything would be whole. Their free walk, sometimes with the woman leading, sometimes with the man stepping ahead, represented love in its matured form. Doubt no longer existed, and the fear of loss had dispersed like a cloud of dust. For modern humanity, this scene symbolized inner wholeness. When we made peace with our own Eurydice, our spiritual counterpart, our inspiration, or our conscience, we no longer felt compelled to look back, because she already lived within us and accompanied every step we took. The tragedy of Orpheus and Eurydice was not, in truth, a story of failure. It stood as a magnificent monument to humanity's capacity to love. A being capable of loving enough to dare descend into the realm of the dead had, in fact, already attained immortality. Today, while walking beneath the stars or watching the street through a rain-streaked window, everyone who transformed that hard-to-define sadness within into a song, a prayer, or a smile kept Orpheus's legacy alive. The golden lyre did not fall silent. It simply took refuge in the rhythm of our heartbeats. That wind descending from the snowy peaks of Thrace still whispered the same words. Love was stronger than death, yet patience was even harsher than love. This epic did not end here. Whenever a person dared to imagine the impossible for another, whenever a soul took a step from its own darkness toward the light, Orpheus and Eurydice continued to wave to us hand in hand from among the green meadows. Their story was our story. Their farewell whisper was our hope of reunion. I hope that as you end your day, this ancient epic has been a good story for you. I look forward to your comments and requests. Do not forget to follow my channel. May the darkness of the night and the rhythm of the sea bring you peace. Until we meet again in another legend, in the breath of another hero. Love.